You're listening to the Knowledge Archives podcast. Welcome to the Knowledge Archives podcast. We're a group of students on a mission to learn from as many different disciplines of knowledge as possible. I'm your host, Madhav Malhotra, and today I'm pleased to be joined by Olivia Varley-Winter, a senior consultant at the Royal Statistical Society in the UK. Her past work has focused on important aspects of biometric monitoring systems, like facial recognition and their privacy concerns. I'm very excited to hear her perspective on the challenges and potential of this new technology. So thank you for joining me today. I'm really excited to learn a bit more about your work, and I'm very excited to hear a little bit more about the details of how this very important technology has been growing. But first of all, I'd love to just ask you a little bit about who you are and your past work.
Yeah, thanks, Madhav. My name is Olivia Varley-Winter. I'm a social researcher and I studied biological science, human geography and environmental policy when I was at university in Durham and Oxford in the UK. In my career, I've gone on to focus on public policy making and public engagement regarding data science and statistics. And in 2018 to the beginning of this year, I worked for the Nuffield Foundation on the establishment of the Ada Lovelace Institute. There I researched and launched their research and engagement programme on biometrics, identities and liberties. And I think what we will be talking about today is the particular challenges posed in society by the development of biometrics.
This technology it's very modern. In the past little while, we've started to see a bit more attention about it. So I'd love to ask you, first of all, what are biometric technologies in general, and how have they progressed over time? And then, in particular, how did one biometric technology, facial recognition with AI, come about in the recent years?
Biometrics as a whole have been around for a long time. They make individualized profiles of biological characteristics, and there are many ways that people are making use of such technologies. You could potentially refer to any combination of statistical or metric measurement of the body as a biometric. However, not every biometric is good to use. So to know from a scientific perspective whether it's a good biometric, you would want to look into a lot of things, and that includes accuracy and checking how representative that measurement is of the person or of the biological characteristic that you want to measure, and how long is that good for, because there are so many representations that need to be tested. But then in terms of how recently the field has changed and developed, if you look back to the start of this century, the period leading up to 2020 saw market penetration of newly connected smartphones, which are capable of registering fingerprints, photo, video, voice recordings. And subsequently, there's been the growth of Silicon Valley companies, Facebook, YouTube, as well as Chinese-based internet firms, Alipay and TikTok, and growth in those areas around the world. So platform companies have become the mainstay of our communication and culture. And alongside that, the growth of digital biometrics has grown because, I think in part that is to do with the pure availability of the kind of raw materials, the imagery recordings that can be used to develop those using machine learning tools. And I suppose the ease of adoption as well into the products that industry can develop, the digital tools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a very interesting introduction to the idea in general, and especially most people, they might have heard about the news headlines with specific examples of the technology, but it's very interesting to hear how you can take any particular characteristic of the body and use that kind of data as a potential way to form a biometric technology. And to go from that high level into some of the case studies that we're going to be talking about, what are some examples of how this technology has been used in the past little while? And how does the introduction of new technologies like mass surveillance with AI change the landscape?
The kind of longest standing forms of biometric technologies that I imagine most of the public are well aware of include fingerprinting and DNA profiling technologies, which have had use in forensic investigations and criminal investigations and kind of featured on crime shows, and that probably increased people's awareness of these tools in the first instance. Then in recent years, we've seen biometrics develop further to try and recognise people according to other characteristics, not just DNA, which is quite hard to gather, but characteristics that are kind of easier to observe, people's faces. And that aspect of being able to recognise someone's face at a distance is often raised as one of the issues with facial recognition technology in particular, because it does raise the prospect of someone being observed unaware. Someone's face, unless they have it well covered, is observable from quite a distance if you have good camera technology. So it's one of the most controversial, I would say, and that's partly because of that factor about it. Some of the others, you do have to be still in greater proximity, use of iris recognition. The use of voice recognition is an interesting area as well that I've not looked that much into, but it raises kind of similar concerns.
And as you mentioned, these kinds of technologies have had a long history of being used in things like forensics. What are some of the other industries that often want to use these technologies? And often we hear about the dangers they pose, but first of all, why are they being used in the first place? What kind of benefits do they bring to these industries?
I'm not an industry expert, or I haven't worked in the industry, but as a kind of broad brush view, it seems that the market starts off in security applications, so gatekeeping to different services, and the view that if you're able to observe the person directly, that recognition is more robust than relying on form filling in some instances. And I think partly it's the perceived convenience of the new tool and the perception that it will ease processing of people or of products and other things. Biometrics can be used in other settings, not just on people. I've read about it being used in farms, for example, to recognise animals. So it's become an alternative way of forming identity systems. And identity systems, in some cases, are mediated between one person and the product they use. So that's kind of one-to-one matching, where they have registered their details on a system, or their details have been registered on a system, and they want to access that system, and it's a gatekeeping exercise. And that you can see that, for example, in some phones now let you unlock your phone using your face instead of using your code or using your fingerprint as well. So that's an example of one-to-one matching. Another example of one-to-one matching there is if someone's photo is held on a police database and the police are then scanning a crowd, and the police are deciding in that instance that they want to try and do a one-to-one match on somebody.
It's interesting to think about some of the benefits involved there, and I'm sure there are reasons why, given like the costs of things and, as you mentioned, the convenience, that this technology is growing. But then at the same time, with the other side of the coin, I've heard about there are a number of dangers that people are now starting to talk about, including yourself, when it comes to these technologies. I saw your work in not just AI surveillance, but also biometric identification in general, and the privacy concerns and other concerns that these technologies bring. So could you give some indication as to what are the different categories of issues that can be brought about by these technologies, and then also any specific examples where we've started to see things going wrong and that we need new solutions for?
Yeah, one that is very often mentioned is the feature of consent in ethics and the importance of consent in ethical practice. There are lots of ways in which the growth of the digital economy has really challenged that, because you can put in methods of people approving something without really having to think about it. There are lots of environments that are being pressed to be more consent-based, but there remain challenges about relying on consent, because there are so many incentives that can cause the person not to necessarily act in their best interests. So they could give consent, but they could feel rather pressed into giving that consent, or not really have much alternative actually in the way the services are designed. So a kind of shift from consent-based privacy to privacy by design is quite an important movement I'm aware of in the industry. And I've also talked about the way in which facial recognition in its nature can challenge consent by being used in circumstances where you don't actually know that it is. So awareness of the technology can be another issue. If you set aside consent, though, and individual ability to choose, there are also issues to do with actually how well the tools work in the first place and whether it's being used on a sort of false pretext of being more reliable than it actually is. And that's been an important issue with respect to equality and diversity as well. So one of the key challenges to facial recognition technology is that it's prone to some of the same biases that other tools are subject to. It's regarded increasingly as a racist technology because of the fact that it's influenced by skin tone. And it's, so far anyway, I've not heard of a tool yet that is equally reliable on all skin tones. So that increases the likelihood of misrepresentation of groups that haven't been represented as well in the training data. And I think that's been a really key driver in the US this year of change happening, because companies that operate in the US regarded it quite quickly as unacceptable to keep selling facial recognition tools to police forces. So they've kind of made a pledge not to be doing that. The knotty thing around that, them ruling out the adoption of policing, the adoption of it for policing is also to do with, is not just the accuracy issue, it's that it's adding power to those systems as well. So there's kind of an inequalities of power issue, which I don't think I've written about quite so much, but which is quite well represented in other literature, to do with tools not being equally available to all to use in their interests. And the kind of wealthiest systems might adopt them first and not adopt them in ways that are in all citizens' best in all interests. And kind of views of how policing and security develop has a big impact on people's attitudes to the tools that they use. You see that in other areas of data-driven technologies as well, or data systems. Being ethical is not just about the function of the tool, it's also about who is using the tool, why are they using the tool, and are people comfortable with the reason for the tool in the first place.
I think that's an interesting mix of challenges to consider when it comes to what we're going to have to do in the coming years, because obviously we see this technology being developed more and more and implemented more and more. And like you said, there's a vast gap in where it's being implemented and also the differences between, say, different countries, between how developed nations are using it and other parts of the world might be. And regarding all of these challenges coming together, I know you mentioned a little bit about how there are some parts of the US where already you're starting to see pushback against this. You're starting to see some sorts of restrictions being applied. What are some of the other promising solutions that are currently being developed to address this issue, say, in the next 5 years?
So if we look at earlier biometrics and their use by policing in particular, there are regulations in the UK at least, and I imagine in other countries as well, for fingerprints and DNA and their use in forensics and in policing. And this development of legislation has been pretty crucial to maintain a sort of baseline level of trust in police use of DNA and DNA databases. And so there's kind of an obvious opportunity there in the sense that the newer forms of biometrics have fallen outside those regulations. They fall under kind of other frameworks that might be a bit more vague in how they apply. And in the UK, at least, the development the use of facial recognition is in the realms of police guidance, which has been regarded as kind of murkier than the previously developed legislation, more open to challenge and more open to development. So the development of regulation is one that increasingly industry has been calling for, in addition to civil society groups and kind of legal and public advocates. And it just seems that when it comes to new technologies in general, and facial recognition is an example of this, where they do raise issues that might benefit from specific regulation, the pace of the technological change is faster than the pace of legal change. But legal change is the thing that would set it on more of a level playing field. The other aspect of it has been the kind of social movements and their responses to this technology. And those movements have been happening in the tech industry itself as well, to some degree. So I think that is promising. That kind of changes how industry thinks about its applications and its systems. And it's to be encouraged that companies, for example, are thinking harder about their technologies. But that's always going to be quite patchy in its application. And that's why the calls for regulation have got stronger, because you have like large companies like Microsoft, Google have been talking about no longer selling their tools to police forces this year. But smaller companies, they are under no kind of public relations pressure to be vocal on this. So you don't really know what the other companies are doing. So in the absence of kind of oversight and regulation, there's not really a guarantee. Yeah, I would categorize it as social movements and also a connection to democracy. So when you have legislation as well, there is a mechanism to connect that with parliamentary systems and with the kind of democratic mandate. So all eyes on regulation, really, from a UK perspective, while also welcoming the fact that the industry might be prepared with tools that are better, that would be more fitting with where ethical conduct would move to.
And it's very interesting to think about the interplay between the two approaches, where sometimes if there's a lack of regulation, there can be movements inspired by average citizens and advocacy groups that can put the PR pressure on the larger companies to make a change in the absence of regulation. And it's interesting to think about, also the gaps in this, where, as you mentioned, with the smaller companies, we don't see that kind of change. So the last thing I wanted to ask you about today was, when it comes to these kinds of approaches and solutions, which areas are you excited to see more work on, and which areas do you think haven't gotten as much attention as they deserve?
I think there's been some kind of slight red herrings in the way that things have been approached. There's been a lot of attention on the bias in artificial intelligence and the racial biases in particular, and there's been a desire to make the tools work better, simply on that objective, how accurate is it, how reliable is it sort of measure. And that is one where the industry is equipped to make progress, because it's based on how the technology actually performs, and the power of the tools could be increased in those areas. But that doesn't necessarily solve your ethical problem. Like, ethical problems are multi-dimensional. So you can have industry working on those problems, and that's good. I mean, or at least it's not bad. It's just kind of, it's a new push. But I think industries that think more carefully about it would not only be trying to get the tool to work better, they would also be thinking about the system into which that tool is adopted. And there are ways in which larger tech firms, I think it's quite incredible the extent to which large tech firms don't think about their obligation to think about social systems and think about people in their systems, and particularly equality and diversity in their systems. And that's something to do with the way in which industry relates to procurement and how contracts work, and whether they even feel it's their job to think about the system into which the tool's applied. There could be mechanisms within how tech companies contract with people, by which they say, you can't use our tool unless you're licensed in a certain way. That could be good on one level. It could also sew up those markets in favour of the largest players as well. So there's also a discourse around competition versus protectionism, and there are arguments around protectionism being somehow let in through these other impulses to regulate.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to hear about some of the different categories there, and some of the side effects especially that need to be considered when we do decide to act on this issue. especially when passing regulations. So thank you for providing all of that insight. If someone wanted to learn more about this field or more about your work in particular, where might they go?
So I undertook this work for the Ada Lovelace Institute, and they are still doing work on biometrics. They've also, it's under the Identities and Liberties program that they're running. So that's all very interesting, and I'd encourage you to check that out.
All right, that's great. So thank you for providing all of this insight today and talking about all of the details involved here.